Welcome to part one of the Legal and Financial Essentials course of the Nonprofit Bootcamp e-learning series. Digging into various legal, accounting, and financial aspects of your business is critical to success, yet it can also be intimidating, especially for smaller nonprofit organizations. This course will cover the basics of legal and accounting, as well as more specialized accounting issues in an understandable way, helping you to action out your legal to-dos with confidence. We will cover fiduciary responsibility, accounting requirements, and issues that are specific to nonprofits working with food. Today's lesson, Legal Basics, will cover the basics of board and staff responsibilities, stakeholder accountability, and financial ethics. Today's presenter is Poppy Davis, joining us from the West Coast. Poppy teaches and advises on business and policy issues affecting family-scale farms and ranches and related associations. She is the Director of Entrepreneurship at the Indigenous Food and Agriculture Initiative at the University of Arkansas School of Law and consults for farm programs across the country. Previously, she was the National Program Leader for Small Farms and Beginning Farmers and Ranchers at the USDA, and prior to that, a California CPA. She holds a Juris Doctor from Drake University Law School, a Master's in Journalism from Georgetown, and a BS in Agricultural Economics from the University of California, Davis. Poppy, take it away.
Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. I'm really glad to be here. This topic of nonprofit ethics and nonprofit board accountability is really important and really dear to my heart. I've enjoyed working with various nonprofits, and I know that it is complicated and that board governance can often be something that doesn't seem so urgent, and so people can put it off, but it really is the foundation of a strong organization. I hope this is helpful framing for you to think about incorporating some of these things that seem like background and non-essential and moving them front and center and really seeing them as foundational to a strong organization. So we'll talk about board and staff duties and duties to stakeholders, and we'll talk throughout about ethics as a framework for this work. My background in the subject of ethics, particularly, I want you to understand this to understand the framing for this and why this is presented at the same time as the accounting piece. As a CPA, you have specialized knowledge in auditing, which is a systematic review of the procedures in place for financial stability for an organization and financial reporting. And you have specialized training in looking for fraud and potential ways that the organization could be defrauded in some ways. So the other part of that accounting requirement, as part of what the requirement for being a certified public accountant, I was required to take 8 hours of ethics training every other year for a good 10 years. So that was part of my foundation in understanding ethics and how they're taught. When I worked for the USDA, you had a fairly significant burden of ethics training that was specifically related to legal requirements, working in a government situation, which closely relates to some of the funding sources that you may have through your nonprofit. And then as a student of journalism at Georgetown is a Jesuit institution, so everything was framed through a strong ethical lens. So I had another ethics class there, formal ethics class and ethics project. And then in law school, there's another formal semester of professional ethics, which is closest to what we're going to talk about now, ethics applied in the workplace. So that gives you my framing for this, which is an approach to ethics that is sort of based on a stem to stern review of how an organization approaches these issues. So we'll talk about board duties now, which you've probably heard the phrase fiduciary duties. The fiduciary duties refer to these 3 duties of a board, the duty of care, the duty of responsibility, and the duty of loyalty. You may hear the duty of loyalty called the duty of obedience. Many of us just immediately hear the word obedience and go in the other direction. So it is also called a duty of loyalty. So we'll walk through in some specific examples of what this means. But the idea of a fiduciary is that a fiduciary has a legal duty to the organization for which it is a fiduciary. So all of these, this formal language, duty of care, responsibility, et cetera, these are legal terms and there's real legal consequences that come with it. Basically, failure to do your duty, you can be held legally responsible. You could be held responsible in a criminal case if your failure to do your duty was criminal in nature. More likely, it would be a tort or contract liability, which is a civil liability. So it's not going to send you to jail, but you could absolutely be held financially responsible. That's certainly not the only reason you do this, but I put it in as framing to understand that this stuff is not optional and it's taken very seriously, and it should be taken very seriously. So good governance mandates that all the board members are aware of what I just said. And when they take on that duty, they take it on in understanding of the seriousness of that obligation. And then once they accept that obligation, the main duty is that they have this duty of care, and they're held to the standard of a reasonable, prudent person, i.e. the other people that would be in a courtroom, say on a jury, judging their behavior. Was it reasonable or unreasonable? In ensuring legal compliance, financial solvency. Those are the main ones. Those are the main ones that get people in trouble. Hiring and supervising the executive director is, of course, closely tied to both of those things, but distinct. In most healthy functioning organizations, that's going to seem like most of what the board is doing, but they should be looking at legal compliance and financial solvency through that lens of how the executive director is doing in keeping them informed of plans to be legally compliant and financially solvent in a way that board members can easily understand. And then finally, the board duty that most board members probably spend the most time thinking about, and in a healthy organization probably that they should spend the most time with, is ensuring that the organization is operating in accordance with its mission and strategic plan. And I know you've already taken classes through this program on strategic planning. We're going to look back at that, but we're going to look back at it a little bit now through this legal and ethical lens. What do those things mean in the context of the legal duties that board members might have? Duty of loyalty. So the duty of loyalty is about putting the organization first. The board members can't be in it for themselves. They have to be in it for the board. That's one of those things that sounds obvious, but we're going to get down into more specific examples of where it might not be so obvious. A lot of times people think about ethics, or a lot of times it's taught or presented in a really obvious way of like, don't steal from the organization. And that's fine and well, and of course people shouldn't steal from the organization, but that's not what makes ethics hard. What makes ethics hard is when people have much more subtle sorts of conflicts, and they really do have to think deeply and consider whose interest they're acting in and what the consequences are from their actions. If the consequences have in some way benefited the organization and its mission, or inadvertently also benefited an individual in an inappropriate way. Okay, so the duty of responsibility has to do with avoiding conflict of interest, very similar to the duty before. This is more specific in terms of not using information gained for personal gain, always acting in the best interest of the organization. And it's not just actual conflicts of interest, it's also the appearance of conflicts of interest. Behaving in a responsible manner towards the mission of the organization without putting yourself first. The staff responsibilities are really the same as the board's, but the specific duties are different. Or I should say that the other way. Their duties, their legal duties are the same, but their specific responsibilities are different. So a staff person also has the duty of care, responsibility, and loyalty, but their tasks are not at that higher level of overall organizational well-being. Their tasks are at the level of what's defined in their job description. For staff who are managers, they have a particular duty of care that relates to their subordinates. So it's important for a staff who's a manager not to be so focused on mission, for example, that they put their own staff in a potentially unsafe situation. And it's important for the whole organization to think about a culture where there are policies and procedures in place to ensure the safety and well-being of staff people in carrying out the mission. An example for sure would be sexual harassment policies, both for internal situations, which would have to do with any employees and board members and their interactions, but also policies that would protect staff members as they work with clients and other stakeholders of the organization. The duty of care for clients is something that we want to take a few minutes and focus in on, because most nonprofit ethics are a little bit, I think, overly focused on duty to funders. And we'll talk about that in a minute. But particularly in this environment of nonprofits that work in the food and farming space, we want to talk and focus about a duty of care for clients, separate from the duty to funders. First thing I want to talk about are Good Samaritan laws, which some of you may have heard of, and there can sometimes be a misperception that this general vague concept, there's Good Samaritan laws out there, and these Good Samaritan laws mean that in a nonprofit situation, when you're doing volunteer work to help others, you won't be held to the same standards as other people in terms of your liability for your actions. That's just not true. That's not what the Good Samaritan laws are about. So specifically for nonprofits that handle food donations, feeding programs, there is one federal law, the Bill Emerson Good Samaritan Food Donation Act, and that law at the federal level was intended to go over the heads of 50 separate state laws that all had slight variations on the amount of liability that an individual or a nonprofit would have in a food donation scenario, and created one uniform federal floor, not ceiling, floor, for how much responsibility could be put on someone who acted in good faith and donated food through a nonprofit system, and something went wrong and someone got sick or harmed or injured in some way from that food donation. There are still state laws that also give specifics, but the federal law takes priority. The important thing to understand is that this limitation on liability only pertains to gleaning food and donating food. I do not think it even pertains to organizations that grow food separately from what is gleaned and donated. So to my knowledge, this hasn't been litigated, but the letter of the law itself does not include any language that would suggest that growing food would fall under this same protection. So that would be a matter of state law, and you would want to look specifically within your state what your liability protections may or may not be if you are also growing food. The other thing important to understand about the Good Samaritan laws is that everything is predicated on the idea that you are operating in good faith according to what a normal, reasonably prudent person would do to ensure that the food is indeed safe. So what's the ethical implication? You should have at least basic training in safe food handling. And if you didn't have at least basic training and you were handling food and someone got sick, it's really hard to argue that people would be particularly sympathetic. So my point in all of this is, don't think you're more protected than you are just because you've heard these laws are out there. The basic duty of care is still what you would think it would be in a reasonable sense. Safe facilities, appropriate hiring and training of staff and volunteers, diligence and competence in pursuing your mission. So if your mission is feeding people, then not only should you be diligent in feeding people, but you should be competent in the sense that people who handle food should have basic food safety training. Another thing to reference back to the Good Samaritan laws is that nothing in the Good Samaritan laws says that basic health requirements at the county level don't still apply. Other issues that come up in the duty of care for clients is confidentiality of information. This is something that's more likely to arise perhaps with organizations that work directly with farmers and might have a lot of private financial data from a farmer. So you would have a duty of care to keep that information reasonably safe and not disclose it to others. And then the important thing that really speaks to the relationship between mission and the board and the programs themselves are that the programs are appropriate. The programs should actually work, and they should actually be in the best interest of those they purport to serve. So it's worth examining a program and asking, does this program do a really good job of paying the salaries of the nonprofit people that work in this program? Or does this program do a really good job of serving the people that it says it's going to serve? And do we have mechanisms in place that help us understand the difference and make our programs accountable to the clients, not just paying salaries? Finally, on understanding staff duties, it's important to understand that it's always the ED's and the board's responsibility what the staff do. So the legal theory, respondeat superior, means the superior person, the managing person, the person in charge, the highest level of the organization, is ultimately responsible for what happens on the front lines. So they're responsible for good hiring practices, they're responsible for good training, and they're responsible for setting an overall organizational culture that promotes the kinds of things that we're talking about. So what are the duties to stakeholders? First of all, who are stakeholders? Stakeholders are funders, program beneficiaries, individual donors, the public at large, and also the staff and board in their own way. So understanding who these stakeholders are, the basic duty to them is a duty of accountability. What does accountability look like? Transparency is mostly how people approach this. Results is closely related. You could have a very transparent organization and it was transparent that they didn't have a lot of results metrics. So they are different things. You could have a lot of results and not be transparent about them, right? Meaningful outreach engagement with the community, not just running a nonprofit program, saying it's available to everybody, but not really making sure that everybody that's supposed to benefit is made aware of the program. So the outreach and engagement in a meaningful way that engages the community that's intended to be served. This is certainly a complaint that many nonprofit organizations have had to answer for, being perceived as coming in from, quote, the outside with, quote, solutions, but not having really spent time with the intended beneficiaries to understand their perspective. So is that a duty to stakeholders? Is that an ethical issue? I would argue that it is. It is a reflection of the basic values of the organization and how the organization goes about fulfilling its mission. It is rare to see actual elected representation, but it is absolutely possible. It is absolutely possible for a not-for-profit organization to be organized legally in such a way that the board members are elected from the people who are supposedly served by the organization, or that some number of the board are elected and others are appointed. In reality, most nonprofit boards operate with an appointed board. It's important to think about that process of how the board is appointed, who does the appointing, and contrast it with the more rare situation where some or all, or maybe half of the board members are elected from the membership of the people that are served by the organization. Certainly much more difficult to organize yourself that way, and not without its own ethical challenges. But it is a way of tying accountability in programs and services to the people that are supposed to be served. So I said at the beginning that part of why I teach this, tying ethics back to money, is from the background of coming at it from the lens of money, but also in a very practical sense, the problems come from lack of money. They don't always come from lack of money, but that's usually how they present, and it's certainly usually how it's easiest to discover that something has gone wrong. Funders and donors are not the center of the universe in terms of ethics, but it appears that way because funders and donors are the ones that give the money and have expectations about how the money is going to be used. And then when the money isn't used in that manner, they're often the ones that are best positioned to hold the organization accountable for having failed to use that money as intended. So it's just more common that you see examples of failures that have to do with how money is used. The motivation why money ends up getting used in a manner other than as intended usually comes down to the fact that the organization didn't have internal structures in place to give the managers foresight to see when they were running out of money, why they were running out of money, which programs were and weren't going to be having shortfalls, and then managing from a little bit more of a crisis perspective than they really should have been. They have a sense that they need to just move the money from one place to another to cover the shortfall. That's all preventable with good systems. And so one way to approach the rigor of having good, strong accounting systems that allow you to see 9 months into the future is as an ethics issue. If you can see 9 months into the future, you're never going to be in a crisis situation where you feel that you need to take money intended for one program and use it to supplement another, or else that other program crashes. You have enough foresight to dial it back in time or to fundraise in time. Other places that money causes conflicts with ethics are just straight up cutting corners on program delivery because you're under budget. And so rather than delivering a really good program, you deliver a very mediocre program, or perhaps even a program that has some flaws or some unsafe conditions attached to it, as opposed to a program that's adequately funded and not cutting corners. And then cutting corners on administration is really, I think, in most cases where all of this begins to be problematic. Failing to prioritize really good internal management, really good, strong accounting systems leads to problems. It just does. So one way I want to try to motivate you to feel really great about an investment in something that seems like it doesn't serve the frontline mission of the organization is to understand that accounting system as your strongest reflection of an organizational culture of taking good care of the money that you're entrusted with and using it to run really quality programs. A poorly run organization is also an easy target for someone who is planning on behaving themselves unethically and stealing and misappropriating from the organization. So the best way to prevent problems is to ensure adequate funding so you're not operating always from a sense of crisis and shortfall, not sacrificing good management for a bit more programming. I think that really is the essence of where most people have to face ethical choices in running a nonprofit. The do-gooder in them is just driven by passion to provide more programs. And they feel like it's better to provide more program and less administration overhead. And they lean in that direction. And by doing so, they ultimately weaken the organization's long-term viability and long-term ability to provide high-quality programs. So the ethical place to stand as a person in charge of the nonprofit is to be disciplined and set high standards. Think about doing less, but doing it better, and growing slowly on a solid foundation, and always having that standard of excellence and ethics as a reflection of who you are and what you do. So in practice, it's very common that a board will come up with a set of values as part of the mission and the strategic plan, but then typically there isn't follow through with specific policies and procedures that operationalize those values and really test in every situation with every program, are our values actually being reflected in how this program is delivered? Or have we sort of overlooked some logical inconsistencies in our programs? So the elements of an ethics policy would include good examples for board of what their basic fiduciary duties are, and then explicit examples of conflicts of interest and explicit procedures for board members to recognize when they might be falling derelict in some of these duties and what they would do. And a simple example of what they would do is typically to stop doing the thing that has the conflict Very often a board member will just temporarily excuse themselves from a particular decision because there's some sort of personal conflict with that decision that makes it hard for them to be totally objective. Other elements of an ethics policy would address the organization's duties to staff. Shouldn't ever overlook that, the duty of care and responsibility. So first and foremost, the safety and well-being of staff, but also understanding that there shouldn't be preferential treatment of any staff member or conflicts of interest around that. So that would be processes to make sure that certain individuals weren't promoted unfairly over others, or other individuals weren't unfairly not given opportunities to learn and grow. The staff's duties to the organization are an area where there really should be detailed procedures and careful training so that the staff really understand what they're expected to do in an ethical sense as well as in a procedural sense. So the duty of care for a staff person includes diligence in accomplishing work. So that means you really work when you go to work, right? Normally not a problem in a nonprofit. If anything, nonprofit staff often need to pay attention to their duty for self-care. Nevertheless, it is absolutely a duty to be diligent in accomplishing your work. Continued learning is probably a reasonable expectation of staff. If they are in a position to be providing knowledge and information, it should be current and accurate knowledge and information. And they have a duty to be honest in their communications about assessing programs, clients, and organizational effectiveness. These aren't things that are legal duties in the same way that the board is legally responsible. These are things that are more at the level of the board should expect these things of staff and should communicate to staff that these are the expectations. In doing so, the board creates an overall environment of an organization that is concerned with ethics and outstanding service and delivery and isn't cutting corners on these things. Responsibility tracks exactly as in other places, no preferential treatment or conflicts of interest. So to the extent that staff has discretion about which clients they serve, they shouldn't use that discretion to serve their neighbor or their relative over someone else who's equally worthy of the organization's assistance. And an organization, depending on its type of work, might want to have a specific policy in place that would give some examples of situations that could be conflicts of interest and ways that a staff member could remove themselves from that conflict. And then the duty of loyalty, again, faithfulness to the mission, abiding by organizational structure, procedures, and policies. This really means not going off-road. So it's not acceptable for a staff person to make an on-the-fly decision that they think in their heart may have some superior ethical value and that it's going to help this person extra and more today, but in a way that may in the long run harm the organization overall. The staff has to be there doing their jobs, understanding that their duty is to the organization and that following the things that have come out of the board, out of deliberate thought from board and management is what's in the best long-term interest of the organization. So as a whole, the organization has duties to its clients: honesty, diligence, accuracy, and confidentiality. These are all very important with organizations that are providing direct technical assistance to farmers. Understanding the limits of those duties, what the client expects, and what the staff is actually capable of delivering. Again, on responsibility and loyalty, as with other duties, in the duties to the clients, no preferential treatment, but also a loyalty to any applicable state and federal law that's intended to protect the client or the community. So you don't ever want to end up in a situation where your nonprofit is helping a client break the law because it's in the client's best interest to break the law, right? That would set up inherent conflicts. For licensed professionals working at a nonprofit, there are additional ethical considerations. Mostly, you just want to understand that their license is going to take priority. And so you want to be sure to set up an environment where that is correct and expected and supported. a licensed counselor, a medical professional. It could be a licensed attorney or even a licensed CPA, other business professional. When they're providing services through the nonprofit, they're still obligated to their own professional ethics. And they may, in fact, be obligated to become whistleblowers against the organization if they found that the organization was in some way encouraging them to not meet their ethical duties to their clients. All right, so now we reach the duties to funders, which is, as I said before, really where a lot of these things begin and end. It's not that it's not important, it's just that in this realm of food and farming, we really need to think about the programs as well. The duty to the funders is to use the funds only as intended. That can become a real legal duty if your funder is the federal government. That's not an ethics issue, that's just a straight up legal contractual obligation. But you also have a legal contractual obligation with a regular foundation funder. They just might not enforce it in quite the same way as the feds would, but it's the same duty. The funds are not given as a free-for-all. That's extremely rare. They're given for intended use, even when it's general support. It's general support for the administration of the organization related to the stated mission. So, duty of care includes the duty of good stewardship of funds. It's not possible to be a good steward of the funds if you don't have a basic accounting system. Part of the duty is to be able to report to funders as requested or required, and that again goes back to an adequate standard accounting system. There's lots on ethics for fundraisers themselves. So for example, if you hired a grant writer to write a grant for you, and then they were going to write their salary into that grant, there's lots of information on specific codes of ethics for fundraisers. So I would just say, on taking this in, to be clear that your ethics policies around funders are important, but they're not enough. You also need to be able to think about your ethics policies around your programs themselves. So something to think about in terms of the duties to community and your ethics policy might be the very difficult questions of when to break confidentiality and when to cease assistance. And these are the kinds of things you will almost always see in the ethics policies for licensed professionals. You have a duty of confidentiality to the client, but if the client tells you something that poses an imminent and credible threat to life or property, then you have a different duty, and you may have the duty of breaking that confidentiality. The duty of ceasing assistance, if the client lets you know that they intend to harm life or property, then it's certainly not good to continue to assist them in doing that. At a lesser level, and much more common in the nonprofit world, helping a farmer is, what if you find that you're working closely with a farmer and helping them become financially sustainable, but then it becomes evident that they're not paying their labor according to state and federal labor protections, and they intend to continue not paying their labor, not treating their labor according to state and federal labor protection law. What is the role of your organization in continuing to provide assistance to that person, or in letting that person know that you're not going to continue to work with them if they're going to continue to be out of compliance with these kinds of laws? The hard part of ethics is when two duties come into conflict. And the hard part of ethics training and policies is coming up with policies and procedures that help people really understand the hierarchy that exists in that context of the organization and the organization's mission and ethics. So the organization's compliance with applicable law, that's good for the organization. It may or may not always maximize the organization's ability to fulfill its mission, but the organization still needs to be in compliance with the law. Clients and staff's well-being may well need to come as something that comes before serving clients, that you don't want to be serving clients in a way that is knowingly abusive to staff. Funder and board directives are going to take priority over an individual staff person's on-the-fly decision of what they think is right to do in the moment. And community interests need to be considered as well. So There is no one right answer here, but what would go into an organization's ethics policy would be a pretty rigorous examination of how these kinds of conflicts might play out in the course of your regular programs and mission. And what sorts of things do you anticipate, and how do you plan to make sure that people are prepared to address these conflicts? At a minimum, you want procedures for grievances and whistleblower protection and for confidentiality and data protection. Those are the minimum things to have in place. You should also have specific guidelines for staff to follow when they're faced with the kinds of ethical conflicts that you can imagine. For example, if you're working directly with farmers, probably one day you're going to run into someone who isn't in compliance with labor law. That's pretty predictable. So that would be a really obvious thing to have a basic procedure in place to give your staff support to know what to do in that situation. The key thing is giving an individual a path to support from others, and not just leaving the individual staff person literally in the field on their own, trying to understand where their duty lies. If it's to the farmer they said they were going to help, if it's to the organization that pays their paycheck, or if it's to a greater sense of societal being law-abiding within society. How is that staff person supposed to navigate those conflicts in that moment? And the answer should really be that they should immediately have a mechanism to get support within the organization so that they're not the only one making the decision. It's important as part of training and support to recognize that there may well be situations where an individual's desire to provide immediate aid or their sense of what they think is ethically right may be in conflict with the law or with what the organization has determined is best for the organization. That's not necessarily a bad thing. The point is that that's where people need support and training, is to get past that in a good way. So an ethical organization is one that recognizes that and will help an individual to recognize the difference between their duties in the context of employment and in the context of their internal sense of what they would rather do as an individual. And that person, that ethical person, should understand their duty to the organization and how that may come into conflict with what their personal preference may be. And they should have pathways to remove themselves from a situation that they find gives them great personal conflict. And the pathways might include asking to be removed from a particular situation, but still staying on in good standing as an employee. They could feel that they have to resign their position, but that's a better position to be in than to keep their position and then knowingly be in contradiction with the organization's policy. And then finally, they might need to become a whistleblower if they have cause to believe that what their manager is telling them is really not the right situation. And whistleblowing is tricky because there's whistleblowing in the way that you might whistleblow for actual legal issues outside of the organization. And then there might be whistleblowing internally, that the board might be under the impression that everything is great and they have great ethical people and great ethical policies. And then a staff person may find, well, my manager on this day was definitely directing me to go against what the board policy is. That's not necessarily something illegal, but it is something perhaps that a staff person could feel that they needed some mechanism for being a whistleblower internally, just on their manager up to the level of the executive director or the board. This is all stuff you really want to try to think through up front and not have people making it up in the time of crisis without guidance. So here's some examples. I'm not going to go through these examples in a lot of detail because we are going to head over pretty soon to the discussion part of this, but you have them on the slides so you can work through them. And these are examples of if you adopt an ethics policy or if you adopt policies and procedures to bring ethics into every part of your organization's work, you're going to want to really focus on specific examples of things that either have happened or things that require very little imagination, and you can think, oh yeah, that could happen in our organization in the coming year. If that happened, nobody would say, oh, I'm so surprised, I never could have imagined that, right? At the very least, to walk through those scenarios. So, and then to walk through them in terms of your various duties. So as an example of a duty to staff, what would happen to a staff person if they were in a position where a major donor was behaving totally inappropriately to them, and for their own well-being, they needed to not be in that situation. On the other hand, they understood that if their organization lost that major donor, it would probably really affect mission. The answer is don't leave that staff person alone making all those decisions on their own. Have a procedure in place so the staff person can get out of that situation and other people can deal with the financial consequences, possibly. Duty to the organization and board. There could be examples here, all sorts of different examples of how a staff member might find themselves in the field in conflict with what board members are thinking of doing for the overall long-term good of the organization and what a staff member is faced with in the moment helping a client. That's going to be completely specific to your organization and the kind of work you do. Duty to client, same thing, just a flip of what I just said. So think through all sorts of different situations where you ask, is our program really providing this client with the services we say we're providing them with, or are we somehow falling short? Or if we see something that the client's doing that we know is wrong and we know is problematic, but we do not ourselves possess the technical expertise to actually get the client out of that trouble, then what's the ethical thing to do? For sure, it's not to pretend you're an expert and start helping them in an area where you don't have the appropriate expertise. Although for many that becomes tempting, and it's certainly possible and understandable, particularly for young staff, that they would confuse being diligent in their work and wanting to go the extra mile and rushing back to the office and doing a whole bunch of research, and they're going to bring it back to the client and give them this research and help them out. But maybe it would have been better if that staff person had just recognized that that's just a whole technical area that they're not adequately trained in, and the appropriate thing to do is refer the client to an expert and back off and wait until the client resolves the situation with the expert. Duties to funders, talked about that a lot, lots of resources on that. Key thing is always moving the funds from where they're intended to where they haven't been intended without getting the right permission from the funder. So bottom line, if you're going to have the policies, you have to have the training. You can't just write them down and leave them there sitting on a shelf. That's not the point. It's probably pretty active training. It's probably training as part of onboarding because these things are basically part of your job duties, and keeping the training updated. So just to close out, and a reminder here of why this is important, not doing it, why not doing it matters. These things can turn into real legal liabilities for the people that are in charge of the organization. So at the very least, this all is a board issue. The board needs to understand these things, and then they usually charge staff with supporting the board in making sure that the board is compliant with their basic fiduciary duties. Important to mention at this time, directors and officers liability insurance, which is intended to protect directors and officers who are in good faith trying to comply with their fiduciary duties, and then something slips through, they make a mistake, they are in fact responsible, they're held responsible financially, the insurance has their back in that case. It would be very unwise for any individual, certainly any individual who had any personal wealth at all, or any future earnings potential, to take on a role as an officer of a nonprofit organization without asking if there's adequate directors and officers liability insurance. I think as we've been working through some of the things that an ethics policy covers, many of you may have started to think, oh yeah, there's a whole lot of things that could go wrong and a whole lot of ways we could be held accountable for not having done better. And that accountability, ultimately, if someone has to sue to be compensated for some harm that was caused them, that may end up costing them, say, long-term medical expenses, They may well try to sue for money, and if the organization doesn't have it and there's a wealthy board member, that may well go to that board member. So again, that's where this directors and officers insurance is really important to have. So it's never there instead of doing the right thing. It's there in addition to doing the right thing for when, for whatever reasons, it falls through anyway. There's great resources on this. The Nonprofit Risk Management Center has resources, and there are various organizations that provide this kind of insurance and will provide lots of education and support around it, so they don't ever have to pay out on the insurance policy because everybody's doing such a good job that they don't have these problems. So, closing slide before we go over to Zoom and have a chat. It's all about organizational culture, and the culture is top and bottom. How you treat people is an indicator of your organizational ethics, but it can be a problematic one. How people treat each other is just personal by nature, and when you accuse someone of interpersonal interactions that are unethical, you're sort of immediately deep in personal conflict. How you treat money is a much easier indicator because it's not so personal, and you can evaluate an organization's system of how they do their financial accounting without really needing to get into anyone's skin and really question who they are and where they're coming from. So it doesn't mean that focusing on the money for your ethics takes up the whole space of ethics. It's just really one of the easier and cleaner ways to get at it. And if you have a great system for taking track of your money, you're more likely to have an ethical organization, but it certainly doesn't solve all the other problems. It certainly doesn't mean it is, by definition, an ethical organization. The flip side, though, if you think you have a great ethical organization, but you don't take care of your money, it's a little bit harder to say it's such an ethical organization because keeping track of the money is a key ethical requirement. So the policies and procedures around money are a minimum requirement. So the next two webinars that I'll give are going to get off the ethics train and just get really specific on what those policies and procedures around money are supposed to look like as a minimum standard. And then the final thing to say is that ethical violations that touch on money are much more easy to identify and prosecute than ethical violations that are maybe equally real, but less concrete and less easy to prove.